Formula One changed virtually everything for 2026, and within 1 week of the first race, the sport's own drivers were calling the result dangerous and artificial, while the FIA was already in meetings talking about changing some of it back. Albert Park was supposed to be a celebration. What it became instead was the introduction of a phenomenon called superclipping, and by the time the checkered flag dropped, it was the most discussed technical problem Formula One had seen in years. Superclipping works like this. Because roughly 50% of total power comes from electrical energy, when that battery charge runs out mid-straight, the internal combustion engine alone cannot hold the speed, and the car visibly decelerates while the driver's foot is still flat on the floor. You can watch it happen on the onboard cameras. The driver has not lifted. The throttle has not moved. The car is simply running out of charge. George Russell, who took pole position, was visibly slowing into turn 9 at Albert Park during qualifying, not because he chose to lift, but because the battery had gone and he was still at full throttle while the car pulled back beneath him. Albert Park got flagged as one of the 4 worst circuits on the entire 2026 calendar for energy management because it offers very few heavy braking zones and almost no low-speed corners where the car can claw back meaningful charge. On paper, the race delivered around 130 overtakes, nearly 3 times the figure from the same event in 2025. And Formula One promoted that number loudly. The drivers had a completely different interpretation of what those moves actually represented. Lando Norris put it bluntly, "It's chaos, you're going to have a big accident," which is a shame. It's very artificial, depending on what the power unit decides to do and randomly does at times. You just get overtaken by 5 cars, or you can just do nothing about it sometimes. Max Verstappen was just as direct. "I love racing, but you can only take so much." I think they're willing to listen, the FIA and F1, but I just hope that there is some action because it's not that I'm the only one saying it. Yuki Tsunoda described what it actually felt like from inside the car. Honestly, it's not super fun to drive in the race. You're just constantly managing energy, running out of energy, slowing down at the end of every straight. Norris went further than frustration and raised an outright safety concern. When one car deploys the overtake override mode with a full battery and another driver has nothing left, the speed difference between them becomes genuinely dangerous. His exact words were that at that kind of speed difference, a driver could go over the fence. Pure pace told its own story. Russell's pole time at Albert Park was 1 minute 18.518 seconds. In 2025, Norris had set the fastest lap ever recorded around that circuit at 1 minute 15.096 seconds. Over 3 seconds separated those 2 qualifying sessions at the same track, and that gap is a fairly clean summary of where the 2026 regulations currently stand. Not every voice in the paddock pointed in the same direction, though. Lewis Hamilton called the race genuinely fun to drive and was the most enthusiastic presence on the grid. Kimi Antonelli, who finished second, said there was plenty of action and that the whole thing exceeded his expectations. Russell, who won the race from pole, offered the most measured read of all, acknowledging the frustrations but pointing out that you cannot have drivers who are perfectly happy and also have an amazing race for the viewers at the same time. While the rest of the grid was fighting the energy management problem that every team shared, Aston Martin arrived at Albert Park carrying a separate and more specific one. Back in pre-season testing in Bahrain, Honda's brand new 2026 power unit had been generating vibration levels that no team could accept across a full race distance, and the effects of that problem shaped everything Aston Martin did in Melbourne. Fernando Alonso was brought in and retired after 21 laps, a deliberate call by the team to protect components rather than any kind of failure. Lance Stroll ran 43 of the 58 laps before being called in for precautionary checks and ended up unclassified. Chief Trackside Officer Mike Crack confirmed that the countermeasures they had applied to the vibration issue had performed well enough that finishing both cars was genuinely possible. The team chose not to find out. Adrian Newey, who crossed from Red Bull to Aston Martin as team principal heading into 2026, now finds himself managing what was supposed to be a landmark season for the constructor through a challenging and very public opening chapter. Away from the racing itself, a technical controversy had been quietly building since before the season began. The 2026 regulations brought the permitted compression ratio down from 18.0 to 16.0. The measurement, however, was only taken on a cold engine, not at the 130-degree operating temperature the unit actually runs at during a race weekend. And that gap between cold measurement and hot reality became the heart of an allegation that multiple teams levelled at Mercedes. Several constructors claimed Mercedes had exploited the cold measurement rule to extract a performance edge that the regulation was never intended to allow. Mercedes denied any wrongdoing. Toto Wolff's initial position was that changing power unit regulations mid-process could genuinely hurt performance, though he softened that stance as the pressure built. The FIA's response was a staged fix. From the 1st of June 2026, the compression ratio will be measured under both hot and cold conditions. From 2027 onwards, only the hot operating measurement at 130 degrees will apply. What makes this notable is that it was a concrete mid-season regulation change agreed and announced before the 2026 season had put a single car on a starting grid. The FIA and Formula One management had not been sitting back waiting for the noise to build. An evaluation timeline had already been agreed between F1, the FIA, and the teams during the gap between Bahrain pre-season testing and the first race in Australia, built specifically to avoid the kind of reactive decision-making that often creates more problems than it solves. Albert Park was acknowledged from the start as one of the worst possible circuits to draw conclusions from, because its layout works against the new energy architecture in almost every way. The Chinese Grand Prix at Shanghai, which sits at the opposite end of the spectrum as one of the best tracks on the calendar for energy recovery, would serve as the real data point. After Shanghai, the FIA would sit with the teams, look at what both races had shown, and decide what needed to change. The Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka on March 29 was identified as the earliest realistic window for any urgent rule adjustments to take effect. FIA single-seater director Nicolas Tumbazis confirmed that specific options were already waiting. His words were, "We have a few aces up our sleeves on that, which we didn't want to introduce ahead of the first race as a knee-jerk reaction, and which we will review with the teams after China." 3 routes have been discussed in concrete terms. First, allowing cars to harvest energy more efficiently while running at full throttle, which would blunt the severity of the speed drop on the straights. McLaren team principal Andrea Stella reportedly put forward increasing the superclipping threshold to 350 kilowatts as one avenue. Second, pulling back the total electrical deployment levels so the available boost stretches further before the car hits that penalty cliff. Third, raising the internal combustion output to push the power balance back toward the petrol side. A possible window opened up in April as well. Reports indicated the Bahrain and Saudi Arabian Grand Prix were at risk of cancellation due to the situation in the Middle East, and if that gap materialised, it would give the sport additional time for a more substantial package of changes ahead of Miami in May. None of that was confirmed, and the Japanese Grand Prix remained the working deadline for anything urgent. Underneath all of this runs a tension that goes beyond energy maps and deployment curves. These regulations took years to build, and they were constructed partly to bring manufacturers like Audi and Honda into the sport on the promise of road-relevant hybrid technology with genuine sustainability credentials. Rewriting them within weeks of the opening race risks sending a signal to those same manufacturers that the rules they designed around are not as stable as they were told. James Vowles of Williams framed the danger plainly. "I think the worst thing we can do is change it and make it worse." Tumbazis described what success actually looks like from the FIA's perspective in equally direct terms, saying the single measure that matters most to Formula One Group CEO Stefano Domenicali is whether the fans enjoy what they are watching. Whether that answer is yes or no is still being worked out, and what comes back from Shanghai will carry a lot of weight in deciding what Formula One does next. The FIA has options ready. The teams have a process in place. Shanghai is the decision point, and what gets announced before Suzuka will tell us whether this is a 2026 that course corrects quickly, or one that is remembered for finding out exactly how hard it is to redesign a revolution while the season is already running. Subscribe and stay across the channel as this story develops through the year, and drop your take in the comments below. Do you think the racing at Albert Park was genuinely exciting, or was it artificial chaos dressed up as a spectacle, and what would you actually change if the decision were yours?